I'm continuing reading my book As Mother Lay Dying. We finished part 1, The Dying, and we're starting today with part 2, The Bereavement. Chapter 10. Everything has changed and nothing has changed. Mother died and people still went shopping. Everyone that had work to do went to work. Government still governed. People still cooked their dinners, and life went on without a backward glance. If I expected something to mark the passing of a life, something like a small tidal wave, or an earthquake, or perhaps the seasons changing oddly so that winter followed summer and autumn didn't happen at all, I would be disappointed. The moment of Mum's last, almost inaudible breath in the wee small hours one Friday morning was the same moment that a million other people took a last breath. All around the globe, a million final breaths may have amounted to a small gust of wind, so small was the letting go. Or it may have been as much as a tornado sweeping over the world in a magnificent gust of power and transition to the next stage and the nothingness of death. Or the passing through this final breath, through the heart ceasing to work, over to another world where all we imagine may or may not be true. If this was the case, if all these final breaths were to gather and circle the world in some way, then every moment of every day of all time would be marked by gusts of wind, passing of souls, the last sounds of the last moments of life. Time has passed, and the funeral marked for many the public face of their grief. It was a huge funeral. It was a good gathering of all people from all of her many years on earth. Most people wore black, and it would have been everything that Mother would have wanted. The 15 extra priests flew in from around the UK on the morning of the funeral to join my brother, Father Dominic, and her local parish priest, Father Peter. It was as if there was a Catholic drum beating to summon the faithful on the death of one of their most special members. It summoned the priests that Mother had known and encouraged long before they became priests, when they visited our house first as boys and later as young men, friends of her youngest son, my brother Dominic, who was part of the group that went off to Rome to train for the priesthood in the 1980s. No one knew that so many priests, so many of my brother's contemporaries, and so many of the older priests from the places where Mother had lived and worshipped and been involved in such things as the Lourdes pilgrimage, where she was the head matron for the nursing staff, none of us knew that they had all heard the beating of the Catholic drum announcing both her death and the her funeral date, and had agreed amongst themselves to come and celebrate for her for this last public honouring of her life. When her Requiem Mass started at the Catholic Church in Petworth, we, the congregation, watched as the parish priest and my youngest brother walked from the vestry through the church and onto the altar, followed by wave after wave of beautifully gowned priests, young and old, in purple and gold and embroidery and magic. It reminded me of comedies on television in the 1970s, when a tiny bubble car would pull up and hundreds of people would get out of it. Mum's Catholic credentials were well and truly as high as they could go. My aunt, who lay down one afternoon on her sofa and died, hated the Catholic Church. It had given her nothing. It had taken away more than it had ever given her. She came to Mass on her visits to us when my brothers and I were children, and changed the words of the service under her breath to make us laugh. She was witty, rude, and very funny, and we knew we mustn't let our mother hear her. My aunt's withering comments on the services she attended with us did not alarm me at all. I accepted her subversive version of the Mass alongside my mother's wholesale surrender to it, and did not for a moment think that one of them was right and one was wrong. My aunt made me laugh, and she made me feel wonderful. That was all I cared about, that, and wearing her false eyelashes, her wigs, and her size 4 platform boots. After this aunt's funeral many years later, my mother made me drive to the undertaker in Birmingham from Petworth with great speed and secrecy, so that she could take her sister's ashes home before anyone else could get them. It felt like a smash and grab. There were still 2 of her brothers, her younger sister, my dead aunt's daughter-in-law, and her grandson to consider. But some fury took hold of my mother, and my aunt's ashes were fetched and placed in the Crown Derby tureen on my mother's dining room table at home, with an unspoken challenge. "I have the ashes," she seemed to imply. "Fight me." She placed them over the very spot that a few years later she herself would draw her own last breath. One evening, Mother took Dominic to her local Catholic church, and inside the graveyard, by a wall, and therefore on consecrated ground, when no one was looking, she instructed Dominic to dig a hole, where she quickly buried her sister's ashes. Dominic was a Catholic priest. All the Catholic stuff that my aunt so hated and my mother so loved was done. Dominic felt powerless to resist. Our mother was very insistent, and there is a small stone to mark the illegal Catholic grave by a wall just inside the local graveyard, where my mother asserted her authority and gave her sister the nearest thing she could to a Catholic burial. Recently, I planted flowers by that stone over my aunt's possible burial spot, perhaps to mark the spot, perhaps to quieten the arguments between the 2 sisters in heaven. But I expect my aunt would have laughed. She had no need of this earthly stuff now anyway. If it gave my mother, her sister, comfort, she would have said something rude, poured herself another heavenly gin, and let it go. My father was an Anglican. It was a bold move in the 1950s for a Catholic to marry an Anglican and vice versa. One of the conditions of their marriage between my parents was that the children would be raised Catholic. We knew that, and we were content. God liked Catholics best, so it was just as well. I remember the nuns in my primary school asking the class at morning prayers to pray for poor people and Antonia's father, who was an Anglican, that he might become a Catholic. It was all very jolly, and I prayed along with the rest of them, and my father stayed resolutely Anglican. It was a huge joke in our house that Dad was not a Catholic. Every time he was the subject of our morning prayers, I would tell him, in order to hear him laugh and tell me that Anglicans prayed for the Catholics too, and that soon God would make everyone an Anglican, and then he, my father, would rule the world. Religions were a good thing, an honourable presence in our family. Both parents took us to their churches. It was a treat for me to go to Dad's church and to see what they did there. They didn't do anything terribly different, but still they were Anglicans, and somehow, somewhere, there was a secret difference which made the nuns in my school pray for my father. It made my father laugh, and it made my mother smile. And since both my parents were unified in their love of God and prayer and church, I felt that Dad was absolutely fine, and that perhaps this praying for him thing was a nun thing and not a God thing, and didn't really matter anyway. The school where the nuns prayed for my father's conversion to Catholicism took religious education very seriously. We not only had religious education, we had doctrine. We called our teachers sister, as that is how one addresses nuns, and one day the sister in charge of religious education set us a story to write on the day in the life of the Pope. The Pope is the head of the Catholic Church and lives in Rome in the Vatican. It was believed then, but not now, that he was infallible. He could not, in other words, be wrong. He was and is a very holy, very powerful, very important man, and I think we children were meant to imagine the importance of the Holy Father, as he was called. I was 8. My story started with the Pope being brought breakfast in bed by a nun saying, "Hello, Pope," and opening his curtains. The Pope woke happily as the nun plumped his cushions and asked what was for breakfast. There were plenty of sausages and eggs and toast and all the things I would have loved if I was the Pope and had my breakfast in bed. There followed lots of chatting and eating sweets and reading letters from all his friends while the nun sat on his bed and told him jokes. I gave the Pope all the things that I would have loved if I was as important as he was. The story didn't go down well, and I was not allowed to read it aloud to the other children. I wonder if they blamed my father's Anglicanism. My mother's relationship to my father and the dreadful fights between them involved all of us children. For a long, long time, I believed her that my father was the cause of all this madness in her. For a long time, I saw that he could not make her better, and I refused to have anything to do with him. Her obsession with him and his leaving her, and her horror of his rejection of her became the explanation of all that she was, all that she became, and all that she suffered in her long life. It became her central story. Eventually, when I was in my late 20s, I realized that I was allowed to love my father and that it was safe and normal to do so. Her sense of my having betrayed her then, too, was terrible. My father's mother and father were an important part of our lives as children. As soon as the Second World War had been declared, they gave their 3 children to my great-grandmother, got divorced, and set off to enjoy the war as much as they possibly could. My paternal grandmother, Nana, was elegant, independent, and beautiful. Her wit was caustic and cutting, and she was not known for her warmth and sensitivity, but I adored her. I remember being delighted that you were allowed to be funny and rude at the same time. It was very impressive, unless you were on the receiving end, which I never was. I just remember watching her in her wonderful New York fashions, with her thin penciled eyebrows, her expensive jewellery and handbags, making me fall about laughing with her caustic and cutting one-liners. When she was 70, Nana used to tell us that she would give up the smart life, leave New York and buy a place in Cornwall and eat chocolate, which she did. My last meeting with her was in a nursing home overlooking a remote and wild sea in Cornwall, Nana sitting in her wheelchair, utterly lost in her dementia, and eating the largest bar of chocolate that she could hold. Her dementia highlighted the waspish and unkind part of her, and her last and only words were to me, "Bugger off." My father's father, Grandpa, lived until he was 93. It was his second wife, Vi, who let us use her grand piano in our home as we were growing up. He and Vi had the house of my dreams in Surrey, a glorious long cottage made up of 2 houses knocked into one, with blue painted windows and roses growing up the wall. The garden seemed enormous to me. It was filled with colourful flowers, full of herbs and lavender, of birds and butterflies and large bumbling bees. It looked and smelt like paradise. My grandfather was a natural, gifted and inspired gardener. Though Grandpa was not very tall, he was physically as strong as an ox, and he could bend metal with his bare hands, or so he said. He certainly enjoyed tough and challenging physical labour, often sustaining serious injury and delighting in recovering quickly in order to do it all again. His hands were the best hands I had ever seen. They were very large and strong, but bore the results of broken fingers and bones badly reset, making his hands look extraordinarily lopsided. He must be strong, I used to think. If his hands have broken while bending all this metal and he didn't even stop to get them mended properly. Grandpa and Vi's garden in Surrey had a meadow at the back leading to a small stream. We children knew that once, many years ago, our grandfather had found a man drowned in this stream and floating amongst the weeds. It frightened us terribly, and we dared each other to go to the stream and see if any other dead people were waiting for us amongst the reeds and the bulrushes. We never found anyone, but we didn't go very often to look. One night, when I was 35 and expecting my third child, my grandfather woke me in the middle of the night. He stood at the end of my bed looking at me kindly, and as I smiled at him, he left. I was woken a little later in the darkness by the phone. It was my older brother telling me that Grandpa had died, and I told him that I already knew. For my mother, growing up as a middle child in a chaotic Irish Catholic family of 7 children and 2 parents in a small house in Birmingham, and then with her most treasured aunt in Ireland during the war, nothing was easy. Mum had a powerful mind, a sense of order, and a love of beauty that was out of place with her own mother, who struggled to raise so many children without much money and no space at all in the home. Mum's mother, my grandmother, had done well in her life. She had running water inside her house, electricity, a bathroom and an inside toilet, and lived near shops with buses to take her there. Her mother, my maternal great-grandmother, lived in a tiny cottage in Ireland with her many children, no electricity, and a long walk over the fields and back every day to get drinking water to use in the house. Her husband had died in an accident when the last child was a baby, and my great-grandmother was left to manage alone. There was no transport but the pony and trap, no path nor roads into the house. Mother told us how she and her siblings would travel on the train to the nearest station near her grandmother's house to be met with the pony and trap. They would be set down in the hedgerow, where across the fields they could see the little house. They then ran the rest of the way through those fields with their bags and cases over to the little house where their cousins lived. Those were wonderful holidays there, Mum said. When Mother arrived in Ireland during the war to live with her aunt, she was shy, frightened, forgotten, and far too thin. She was unable to read and write even at the age of 9. Her aunt took her over, fed her up, gave her beef tea, and taught her to read and write. She opened up a world of wonder, magic, escape and imagination for Mum which never, ever left her. Mother blossomed in Ireland. It seemed that the childless aunt, who by all accounts was not an easy character herself, and her small sad niece were all each other needed. Mother told wonderful stories of the kindness of this aunt to her. A story that seemed to go right to the heart of all that Mum loved was of how special this beloved aunt made Christmas days for her. After lunch, with all the jobs done, my mother's aunt put her sitting in a big chair by the fire with a box of chocolates and a big book of fairy stories just for her, and let her stay there until bedtime. The pleasure and the magic of having recently learned to read was doubled by the wonder of reading of fairies and sprites, witches and goblins, princes and princesses, and with a whole box of chocolates only for her by a roaring fire, and no one to take it away or disturb her. At 14, Mother left school to go to work. Having had only 5 years of education was a constant source of shame to her all her life, and I remember her sitting me down one day when I was in my 30s to tell me something that she had kept a secret. It was very hard for her to tell me what it was, and I imagined that she had been to prison when she was younger, or had 4 other children no one knew about. When the secret was that she had only been to school from the age of 9 to 14, I remember being astonished. "Is that all?" I said. To Mother, it was a terrible confession. I think my reaction was a little insensitive and dismissive. To Mum, education and the pursuit of knowledge, the training and expansion of one's mind was everything. I wish I had been kinder. I had been given all the education I could want. My brothers and I had been educated privately at boarding schools, had gone on to universities, and had taken everything for granted. My mother's secret, so painful to her, was something I could not understand, despite all of my education. I understand it now, and I am so sorry I didn't hug her and tell her it's nothing to worry about, that she had educated herself with intelligence and insight throughout the years, and that her knowledge of such as Dickens, of Shakespeare, and of poetry was worthy of any university degree. The struggle to pass the entrance exam to study nursing at the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford in her early 20s was almost beyond Mum. Helped, coached and encouraged by friends already there, she did pass and began her training. It was an enormous achievement. It was the one time she achieved an academic qualification, and she was proud of it. Dad, however, was studying theology and English. He had gone from his English public school to Oxford, and all was as it should be. But he was lonely, and he had learned to keep his feelings to himself. He had many friends, and his older sister was at Oxford too, but he had learnt to be alone, and if he struggled with his studies, he told no one. The day that Mum brought Dad, an Anglican, back to her home in Birmingham to tea to meet her Irish Catholic family, a picture of the Pope fell off the wall and into the fire. It could have been awkward, but my grandmother and my father took to each other instantly. Her warmth and motherliness and his manners and courtesy sealed a friendship that lasted until he fed her the final teaspoon of his homemade beer on the day that she died in her bed by the piano in his house when I was 11. My mother always said that my father loved her mother more than he loved her. To this day, in his 80s, Dad has a framed photograph of my grandmother on his windowsill.